Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our launch of Eurelectric's Resilience Report, together with our technical advisor, EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute. My name is Caoimhín O'Brien, and I work in the DSO team at Eurelectric. Eurelectric represents the electricity sector in Brussels, including over 3,500 companies. And all of these companies are affected by climate change and the effects of extreme weather. So this report covers the whole value chain with the exception of transmission system operators. So far in Brussels and internationally, we've been really focused on climate change mitigation, and that's really important. But increasingly, we're seeing that adaptation of the power sector to climate change is becoming more and more of an issue. The numbers are not going to decrease, even with the best mitigation measures. The numbers are still going to increase in the short to medium term. So today we have an exciting agenda for you today. Christian Ruby, the Secretary General of Eurelectric, will present the findings of the report. Mark McGranahan, a Research Fellow at EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, will present EPRI's involvement in the project, as well as some other work that they're doing in parallel. Oliver Franz, VP for European Associations at E.ON and Chair of the Distribution and Market Facilitation Committee, will moderate a panel debate with a panel of experts. We've got experts from the Commission, from regulators, from DSOs, generators, as well as EPRI. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Christian Ruby for Christian to present the findings of the report. Over to you, Christian.
Thank you, Caoimhín, and I am delighted to say that more than 400 people have registered for this event online. Please, if you have a comment or a question, do not hesitate to put it in the live chat of this event, and we'll see that we respond to it as fast as possible. What this report deals with is an unrivaled challenge. Over the next 10 years, we are going to see significant changes in the weather patterns of Europe, and it's important to understand that we're not at the end of something, we're at the beginning of something here. And this beginning is already looking pretty grim. Remember the floods in Belgium and Germany last year that caused more than 200,000 outages, killed more than 200 people, and left damages of more than 46 billion euros? Or what about the storms that wreaked havoc in the UK and Ireland, leaving more than 1 million customers without electricity? So we are seeing major impacts on our societies and certainly also on our power systems. Zooming out, we're looking at a change, a structural shift in the weather patterns of Europe, where extremes will become much more frequent in future than they have been in the past. 100-year events may begin to occur every decade, and 1 in 10-year events will also become much more frequent. Looking at hard numbers up until 2030, we're going to see a 50% increase in heavy precipitation. We're going to see a doubling of droughts, and we're going to see a quadrupling of extreme temperature events. And that's just over the next 10 years. The impacts of a changing climate will be felt all across Europe, whether it is as increased precipitation, sea level rise, droughts, storms, etc. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also known as the IPCC, has divided Europe into 4 different regions where the impacts of climate change will be felt in different ways. A bit simplified, the north is going to be about increased precipitation and floods. The south is going to be about fire weather and extreme heat. And in Central Europe and Western Europe, it's going to be about increased amounts of drought. And as I mentioned, this is not about a distant future. This is happening today. Over the past years, we've seen hundreds of hectares burned. We've seen changes in precipitation. We've seen droughts, lost livelihoods, and lost lives. So what's coming for the power system? Well, along with the war in Ukraine and direct military threats to our power system, climate change and extreme weather is adding a very serious component to an increasingly complex map of risks that every utility, every power system operator needs to deal with. As part of this study, we have looked at how the generation assets of Europe are being impacted by different types of extreme weather occurrences. And to make a long story short, all types of assets are being impacted, but in different ways from different types of weather occurrences. The same goes for both transmission and distribution grids that are also going to see significant impacts from the changing climate. So what needs to be done? Certainly, since all assets are going to be impacted, power system operators and utilities have a major role to ensure that their assets are ready for this new era of extreme weather. So whether it's a hydro dam or a wind park or a thermal plant you're operating, you'll want to do something about it and make sure that it's ready for more extreme weather occurrences. The measures range from increased and improved forecasting to reinforcement of dams in the case of hydro, to more powerful cooling systems, for instance, for thermal plants. Grid infrastructure is particularly exposed to extreme weather, and grid operators therefore need to up their game as well, whether it's about operating their grids in more meshed formations, working on their flood management, and or to strengthen lines in order to make them more resilient against falling trees. So what needs investing? Just over the past 10 years, extreme weather events have cost the European societies more than 145 billion euros. So we need to rebuild much of that, but we also need to invest to avoid such situations in the future. This is a task that power companies cannot lift alone. They need the help of governments and regulators because part of the asset base is regulated. And a first step, therefore, is that countries are more aware and more prepared for a future with more extreme weather. And looking at the member countries of the IEA, for instance, we can see that there's really serious room for improvement. In plain terms, countries range from good to bad to ugly when it comes to their readiness on climate change. And it's worth noting that within the members of the IEA, more than a third rank in the latter category. Government awareness is important, especially for grid investments, because they need the seal of approval from the regulator. And we're talking about significant investment volumes. 2 years ago, we mapped the overall investment needs in distribution grids in the period 2020 to 2030. Here we found that some 8% of the 400 billion we needed came from investments in resilience alone. And here we come to the policy recommendations of this study. It's extremely important that we consider adaptation in partnership with mitigation. These are two sides of the same coin. Secondly, we need to take a holistic view to ensure stronger coordination and continuous communication between all stakeholders. Each of us have our part to play in this increasingly complex exercise. And third, we need a regulatory framework that ensures proper funding to a more climate resilient power system. Remember, the power system is what's going to get us out of our climate problem. We need action at EU level, where we should reorganize EU climate adaptation funding. We should involve the sector stakeholders in the climate adaptation. We should make sure that the electricity markets are fit for purpose, and also that the flexibility markets basically are aligned with the physical system and how it's changing. At the national level, it's really key that we get the incentive to invest in resilience. That's not the case today in many member states, and that's critical if we're going to reach the first 8% of the grid investments I showed you for distribution. We also need to integrate the national climate adaptation plans better with the company plans, and we should make possible digital investments by system operators so that the systems are sufficiently digital and ready for the challenge. So these are, in a nutshell, the main findings of our study. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Christian. Without further ado, now I'll hand over to Mark McGranahan of EPRI, the Research Fellow at EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute. Over to you, Mark.
Great. Thanks to Christian and to Quivine for the great introduction and summary of this important report. Let me start out by saying how much we appreciate at EPRI being able to collaborate on this very important effort. We really believe that working on strategies to improve resilience in the face of climate change is one of the key challenges facing our industry right now, and collaboration is critical on that. I'm going to try to give you a little bit of background on EPRI contributions to this report and some of the research that we have going on in this space. If we look in the US, extreme weather events and the associated costs with those events have been increasing for decades. There have been various charts. This is a chart that you may have seen before, but the conclusion is clear that the frequency of these events and the severity of storms that are impacting the grid continue to increase, and resulting in really a mandate that we address this concern with the resiliency of the grid and the assets that make up the grid. So it's a very important effort. I think it's worth looking at what's driving the changes, the impacts to the resilience of the grid and how major events are affecting the grid. And clearly climate change is one of the drivers, increasing the number of these events, the severity of these events, the uncertainty associated with the performance of the grid. But our efforts around decarbonization and electrification are also major drivers as we integrate more renewables, more distributed resources where the resources are out on the distribution system. That is driving the need for capacity and flexibility that becomes part of the equation for the resilience of the grid. And so that has to be dealt with. And as part of our decarbonization strategy, as we electrify more and more of the energy system, in the US, we're predicting that we'll go from about 20% of our energy use right now is electricity to 40 to 60% being electricity by 2050. And those are critical parts of our energy system as we electrify transportation and heat, which just makes the resiliency of that electric system even more critical. So these are very critical drivers that we consider. Even though these events may not be that common, they have to be considered as part of our planning of the future grid and how we operate the grid. So very critical. One of the things that we've evaluated over the last couple of years, we've put together a working group of stakeholders to look at the issue of how we value resilience. How can we use metrics for the value of resilience to help us evaluate options for improving resilience? And this is a real challenge that we're facing as part of a framework to evaluate investment alternatives, looking at both the direct and indirect costs associated with these major events, metrics that include things like equity considerations, that include indirect costs to society, safety, health, economic impact, and then to be able to include all those stakeholders as we come up with approaches for evaluating different investment alternatives. So the value of resilience is one of the critical aspects that we'll be continuing to work on. I think it's worthwhile just to think of a couple of examples that are really driving the concern, and also examples of how companies are moving from a reactive approach to resiliency to a proactive approach. If we look at Con Edison in New York as an example, 2012 Superstorm Sandy impacted the entire city with 2 million customers out of power. And in terms of getting all those customers back on took 13 days. So Manhattan in New York, having customers out of power that long just had tremendous costs and resulted in a multi-stakeholder group looking at investment options for Con Edison to improve the resilience of that infrastructure, and doing that as a collaborative group. And now Con Edison has a climate adaptation and resilience strategic plan that they look at on an annual basis, and that's been the result of that. They've invested over $1 billion over the 10 years from 2012 to raise the resilience of the grid to flood events in particular, where now they look at the 100-year floodplain and add 3 feet to that and make sure their entire infrastructure can withstand a flood of that magnitude, which is much higher than it was previously. In Florida, where they get hurricanes periodically, was very important to deal with the resiliency of the grid to those hurricanes. Florida has been making major investments in making the grid more resilient to high wind conditions, to flood conditions, and those investments continue. And on a multi-stakeholder basis, the utilities in Florida submit plans for their investments in hardening the grid. They help develop the new standards for poles and withstand capability of assets with respect to hurricanes, and continue to make those investments. And if we go back to 2004 and 2005, where the storm Wilma was one of the most critical, and it took over 18 days to restore all of the customers that were out of power. It affected over 75% of the customers in the whole Florida Power and Light Service territory. And we move ahead to 2016, when storms came through and that had a similar impact, and the restoration times were much shorter as a result of hardening that was done after the 2005 storms of Wilma. So continue to get hit by storms, but they're continually making investments that should reduce the costs and the impacts to society associated with those storms. And that kind of planning, multi-stakeholder planning, is key. The final example that I have is Houston, Texas, where Hurricane Harvey in 2017 resulted in 4 days of constant downpour of rain, to the highest amount of rainfall in a period like that in the history of recorded weather for that region, resulting in different kinds of impacts than they're used to, because usually it's wind effects that hit them the hardest. So they had to adjust their planning for resilience based on those flood conditions to deal with future conditions. And already in Texas, they had developed a multi-stakeholder approach for evaluating investments. And now the city of Houston and Centerpoint have a joint Resilience Now strategy that is being developed, and that is looking into the future. So you see examples of multi-stakeholder approaches using events that have happened in the past and impacted the grid, but now providing the basis for looking forward. Finally, I just want to highlight a big collaborative research initiative that we have at EPRI to look at the resilience impacts on the grid and approaches for investments that can improve the performance of the grid during these weather events that are driven by climate change. And this initiative that we call Climate Ready has three parts to it. One is looking at the climate change conditions themselves, the data describing climate change, and specifically data and forecasting that can be used to evaluate the impacts on the grid and the infrastructure making up the grid. So being able to get the targeted data to help us make decisions about improving performance of the power system. The second part is looking at the vulnerability, the kind of asset by asset and overall system from a performance and operations point of view, using that data from climate projections to look at vulnerability and how we can improve the performance of those assets and the overall grid. And with that background of vulnerability and impacts, what we really need and the ultimate deliverable is to come up with a framework that the industry can use for evaluating investment alternatives in adaptation and planning for making those investments in the future. And that's the last work stream, is really taking a multi-stakeholder collaborative and coming up with an approach for evaluating investment alternatives that all the stakeholders can get on board with and reducing the impacts of these events to society overall. So we're very excited about that. And I think we've taken what we've learned so far in this Climate Ready project, as well as our overall research, and tried to bring it to the table for this report with Eurelectric. And it's been very exciting to be part of it. And I really look forward to ongoing collaboration around this resiliency and climate adaptation topic. It's very important to deal with this from a global perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for providing EPRI's perspective. Now I'd like to hand over to Oliver Franz for the panel discussion. Over to you, Oliver.
Welcome, everybody, to the coming storm, building electricity resilience to extreme weather. We are going to go into a panel discussion right now, which I'm supposed to moderate, and I'm very happy to do this. I may welcome the participants. First of all, Elena Vishna-Malinovska from the European Commission, DG Climate. Welcome, Antonio Camisegra from Enel Grids now. Mark McGranahan, you've already met Mark today as he presented for EPRI. Alexandre Marty from EDF, who is going to give us a bit of the power station perspective. And last, but of course not least, as always, Annegret Gröbel, who is working for the German regulator Bundesnetzagentur, but who's joining us today also in a function as the president of CER, which is the club, if I may call it that, of the European energy regulators. My name is Oliver Franz, and I'm the head of European associations in Eurelectric. Okay, so we are here today to talk about resilience, which is an important topic. As we saw from the presentations beforehand, the extreme weather events are actually increasing, and that is a growing challenge to the electricity system as a whole. And as always with Eurelectric, we're taking a holistic approach today. So we're discussing grids as well as the generation side. You are also aware, of course, that by mid-November, the Commission the European Union has been moving towards a more resilient power system in creating or proposing a new cybersecurity law, NIS2, and also a new directive on the resilience of critical entities. And therefore, we're very happy that we can welcome somebody from the Commission, Elena. Happy to have you. And the first question that I would like to ask you is, what have you as the Commission been observing over recent years at European level for climate adaptation? How can adaptation go hand in hand with decarbonization goals?
Thank you very much. Very happy to be And indeed, I'm the head of adaptation and resilience to climate change head of unit in the European Commission. So what have we observed? First of all, I can just confirm the findings that were just presented. The energy sector is affected, and not just by extreme events, but also slow onset factors, such as the sea level rise impacting coastal infrastructure, rising temperatures, changing seasonal energy demand. And there are, of course, also what we call compounding effects of different climate hazards when occurring at the same time. And these represent really substantial risk to business continuity. They are much more difficult to assess, as Mark very much knows. For example, heat waves can drive up electricity demand when droughts affect already the availability of water for hydro and thermal power plants. And what we see is that it is very hard to make the right investment choices. And this is because of fear of sunk costs. So should the high voltage lines be buried underground at high cost to protect them from extreme weather, like in Finland? Should we still rationally invest in new dams, for instance, like in Portugal? But we know and we see that the awareness of risk in the sector is increasing, and the sector is waking up to the challenge, as this event is showing. So where stand our European Union policies to support the sector? First of all, we have a framework. As of last year, the so-called European Union Adaptation Strategy, and it sets several avenues for the sector. First of all, we have published so-called climate proofing guidelines that do handle both the mitigation and adaptation perspective. And they include an obligation for everything that is funded by EU funds to actually climate proof the projects. Second, we are drafting guidelines for national adaptation strategies, which now became an obligation under the 2021 European climate law. At the same time, we are working with the European standardization organizations to make sure that the European standards take the future climate into account. And we've gone now through 20 infrastructure standards, including on gas. And we are running a prioritization study for the next batch of standards. We also are in the process of updates of the national energy and climate plans next year, and climate adaptation needs of the European Union dimensions and energy security will be in. And as you rightly mentioned in your opening, Oliver, the 2019 regulation on risk preparedness in the electricity sector actually provides that the European network of transmission system operators for electricity shall establish regional electricity scenarios, and member states have to prepare national plans that do take into account extreme weather events. Now, how is mitigation and adaptation taken into account? Well, our modeling shows there are many co-benefits. If we switch to renewable sources like wind or solar, we will decrease the water dependence of energy production. If we insulate well and with the appropriate indoor summer comfort, we tick the box of energy savings, energy efficiency, and also of adaptation. And finally, a word on critical infrastructure, if you allow me. Indeed, this is to be introduced into national laws very quickly and immediately, and it will require the critical entities in energy sector to take organizational technical measures, to do background check on personnel, member states to have in place enforcement system, meaning penalties in a case of non-compliance. And we are expecting now to do even more in the aftermath of the accidents on the pipelines, meaning more activities going on into preparedness, into response, and of course recovery after any of these incidents do materialize. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm happy to engage in further conversation.
Thank you, Elena, for what you just presented on what the European Union and especially the European Commission has been doing on resilience topics lately, and that was quite impressive. I would actually like to come back to 3 issues, if I may. First of all, you mentioned that there was a certain, let's say, reluctance to invest because of the fear of sunk costs. And of course, maybe you could elaborate on that a bit more and maybe also mention whether the Commission sees any kind of possibility on lawmaking to take that risk away, or at least to help mitigate that risk, because if that is the real problem, then we should be able to do something about it, I would guess. And secondly, because that's also more or less a regulatory topic, you mentioned that NSOE, of course, is charged with looking at the sector, making all these analyses and so on. And what we've been wondering here at Eurelectric, of course, is, well, as the generation units are moving downward in the system to the distribution level, wouldn't it be an idea, or at least the thought, to also involve DSOs in these kind of deliberations?
Well, thank you very much for these questions. I think the first one is very much about psychology. I think it is very difficult for us to visualize the extreme weather events or the worst scenarios. I've heard a lot of surprise after this summer, yet, you shouldn't be either surprised or shocked. We have all seen in our projections and on our maps. It means this will be, our normal in the future. And indeed, if we want to withstand these shocks, we need to invest into maybe protection that against disasters that may not even materialize. But it is important to invest into what we call redundancies, and which is one of a very important recommendation of the Eurelectric report. Now, in terms of investment from the Commission perspective, we have aligned very much the funding. So the cohesion funds, Invest EU, Horizon Europe. As you know, there is the 2021 taxonomy, which also allows for a substantial contribution for climate adaptation for energy sectors. So in terms of the different investment priorities or possibilities, everything is there. But of course, the sector is nowadays more focused on mitigation, and hopefully, there will be more thought given to these co-beneficial projects in the future. Because in the future, unless your grid and your system will be really resilient, we can indeed be in a situation of blackout scenarios that you have outlined. I don't know whether this answers your question. I think it's really for a very long conversation. Second, in terms of the distribution system operators, I think they are very much acknowledged in the regulation, and member states should consult the distribution system operators at the same level as the transmission system operators for the identification of national electricity crisis scenarios, even before establishing national risk preparedness plans. So that's the first time, the consultation obligation is there. And they need to be also consulted on the methodologies. And now with the establishment of the European Union DSO entity, they will be also part of the electricity coordination group. So I think everything in terms of structures, consultation, is in place for a good participation of DSOs in this process.
Thank you for that. We're happy to be part of that and to go forward, because we believe actually that this is a very important topic. A final one, if I may. Could you comment on your personal view, or maybe on the view of DG Klima, on what digitization and digitalization can do in terms of resilience? What is the role? On the one hand, you could say, well, the more sensors I have, the more sensors can fail. On the other hand, without any sensors, I don't see nothing. So there's a bit of a trade-off going on, I believe, and I would love you to share some thoughts on that one as well.
I'm already not the most digital, savvy generation. That's more for my children. But to say now on a more professional note, I think it is very, very important to digitalize energy systems, and it's very important because of the efficiencies it can provide. It's very hands-on and smart use of energy. For instance, my father, when he goes on his cottage house, he's able to actually make sure that once he's in the house is already warm enough. We are able to optimize the system and the grid for different uses. So I think that it's a non-brainer when it comes to digital. But for the time being, I'm not sure we are yet there in all member states, and also whether all investments are being made, because you need now to think not only the sort of physical cables, but you need also to think in terms of digits, how you activate it, what are the trade-offs, what are the shocks. Here we open up the space again to cybersecurity or other threats. So you need, again, a sort of preventive look at the whole system and what it can indeed, how it can impact. But, the Commission is taking digital as a companion to any policy we are developing nowadays, and also, coming more home to the climate adaptation policy. We will rely a lot on scenarios, a lot on projections, a lot on big data, on artificial intelligence. So trying to visualize what can happen in the future, so that we are better prepared for decision making today on the ground.
Thank you again. That, I believe, was very confident in digitization, and very happy that you shared that. Antonio, this is maybe a good moment to bring you into the discussion, because as everybody knows, Enel has a very digital agenda, I believe, and you might want to mention that. But first of all, maybe as you are here now for the DSO perspective, maybe you can describe from your point of view, and people might also be aware that there is a real resilient strategy within Enel. So how is Enel looking at the issue? How are you coping with it? What are the strategies? What are you doing? And whatever you can share is probably helpful for the discussion today.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very proud and very happy to contribute to the discussion today about the resiliency of the digital networks. First of all, I would like to underline the importance of having a specific, tailored, let's say, approach for the distribution network. So talking about resiliency in the energy sector implies to have a different view on the specific, let's say, ring of the value chain we are discussing in this about. So for distribution grids, this means something very peculiar, because we're not talking of the effects of, let's say, a specific geographical area, but typically the effects of very widespread geographical extension. So for their nature, for their territorial nature, the grids are exposed on a larger scale to the effects of, let's say, the negative weather effects. Which, by the way, it's absolutely not only a winter problem. It's in no way just a winter problem, because the negative effect, let's say, the hearts, the crazy weather is producing on distribution grids in Europe, for example, but we have an experience that it's more than just Europe, goes along the entire year round. So we have, of course, the impacts of heavy precipitations and icing and wet snows and snow sleeves on the conductors, but we experience also very strong and unprecedented strong wind regimes in certain periods of the year. Then we have the heat waves, which are hammering and creating damages probably more than even the winter season. We have landslides. So we are unfortunately exposed. When I say we, of course, I mean the infrastructure is exposed to the entire range of extreme weather effects, the extreme weather conditions that the climate change is bringing to us. It's bringing to us already now. So it's not a future problem. This is a today problem. We are analyzing with a very statistical approach, so to eliminate the, let's say, the background noise, and every year looks like the worst in your life, but when you look with a very scientific and statistical approach, there is no doubt that the grids are suffering from a number of days, a number of events, a number of concurring facts happening all together, so making more difficult, for example, the deployment of restore capabilities when something is happening in a way that is not comparable at all just to 5 years ago, not talking to 10 years ago. So this is a very important topic. Now, the second remarks I would like to do is that when we talk about resiliency, immediately the mind goes to investments, which is okay, very important, but I think a lot must be done in terms of having an efficient operation, because if you can deploy whatever capital you want on a grid, if you don't build up a rescue approach, a rescue excellent capability, there will be no increase in capital expenditure on a grid that in the short period of time can produce any visible effect. So the cost-benefit analysis in this case cannot be run only through incrementing, augmenting the investments, the capital investments, which we already did, for example, in Italy, more than $1 billion in the last period of time. But then we had to also increment our response capability so that you can squeeze response time in a way that is more satisfactory and more safe for the entire society, because the lead time that goes between an event and the restoring of the normal conditions has been reduced much, I would say, more from having the right attitude, the right organization, than from doing the right investments. So there is, let's say, an underestimated value of improving the operations. Just to give an example, in the last 8 years, in the period 17-21, we have invested, well, it's in 4 years, we have invested $1 billion, just 1 billion euros only in Italy, facing 132 extreme weather events across the territory. So it was a very large number of events, all the possible typology of them. And the output, we saw a pattern of improvements by casting those investments and coping them, let's say, joining them with the increased operational capability, dedicated operational capability. We could be able to reduce the final impact on the grids, which means the final impact to the final consumer. So having the grid back operational in a shorter time. So from this point of view, I believe that the cooperation with the national and the European regulatory authorities will be very crucial, because we have a first example, which I think is Italy, by the way, that it's about ending the first cycle of application. So I think Italy was the first regulatory environment where for the first time we had a specifically dedicated framework for resiliency. And I think that observing the goods and the bads of this first, let's say, wave of investment would be very important also to orient the activity at the European level of other countries, because of course very good results were achieved, but significant point of improvement are also, in my opinion, evident in the framework. Having said that, I think it's a point of honor for our national regulatory agency to have been the first, or among the first in the world, to dedicate a specific chapter of the regulation to resiliency, because I think for our, let's say, geographical nature, but also for the, let's say, the forward-looking attitude that we had, we have now in place a regulation that can serve as a model for other countries.
Thank you. So if I may, I would have two questions. First of all, as you mentioned preparedness, also in organizational questions, maybe you would like to elaborate a bit on what is called the 4R plan or way of doing it, because that is, I believe, is also peculiar to Enel. That's basically the philosophy you were mentioning in a bit more detail. And the second one that I would have is actually in reacting to what Elena has been telling us from your DSO point of view. Is there anything else that could be done on European level, or would you say the field has pretty much been prepared on European level and now it's for national regulators to actually harvest or plant and then harvest based on the foundation that Europe has been providing?
Yes, yes. Thank you very much for the question about the 4R. This is let's say our approach to the let's say the hardening of the grids. It's our let's say policy called the 4R, which means risk prevention, readiness, response, and recovery. That's why we call it the 4R. So basically, the philosophy behind it is that we believe that to really cope with the increasing, let's say, the higher frequency of and the higher strength of the weather, of the adverse weather phenomenon, you cannot just rely on the hardening or on the physical hardening, but there is a lot of preparatory work that is absolutely necessary so that the hardening of the grids can pay the best of its value during or after an event. So it's about risk preventions, which means at the level of low voltage or medium voltage grids. Of course, this is a very challenging behavior, but it means, first of all, understanding well the possible damage point during a specific event. So it's very local, detailed analysis of the weakness point that you may have in the grids, considering the peculiarity of the specific local risk that you may have. So winds, snow, rain, heat, and whatever. The second point is the readiness, which means that you have to organize in an economically viable, but in an operative, very, let's say, efficient way, a sufficient number of crew and of and other tools, like, for example, genset generators or other heavy equipment, tracks, and all the possible, let's say, equipments you may need during an event. Organizing all these factors in a very in advance, in a very efficient way, but also having advanced computing capabilities so to maximize the anticipation with which you can understand that the phenomenon is going to happen. So this is about meteorology, yes, but also on understanding the link between meteorology and damage. So to understand if something is happening on my grids, specifically in that location, what kind of problem I'm going to have. So I have all the tools, all the resources available there before the event is even happening. So to be able to try to resist, first of all, hardening, and then to react if something is happening. So that goes to the third R, which is the response, which means that when an event finally is happening, you must be able to operate in zero response time. And when you have a very large grid like we have, this is a big challenge because we have to maintain a deployment capability on a very large scale. So it's not just municipality, but the scale of a region or the entire nation sometimes. So growing the response capability, I think it must be an objective of any regulatory policy. Cannot be also just about hardening or just about investing. And finally, which sometimes is considered the most important one, but in my opinion, just one of the 4R, is the recovery activity. So how much time you need in order to restore power to the in an emergency way to the entire set of your customers in a given location. So we measured this capability with a very severe procedure. So if the 3R before has been played well, on the fourth, it's about, you know, the number of people you send, their skills, the way you can organize them, and the good interaction with the other public services companies because it's a very synergetic job during, for example, with the firemen, with the police, with the local municipality authorities. So when you can coordinate well all these resources in a professional way, in a planned way, the results are very evident. So we keep track events after events. I said that there have been 130 just in Italy, but then I could tell you about Brazil or Argentina or other countries. We keep track event after event of the response time, overall response time, so number of people times number of customers times hours of outages, and we check against ourselves event after event if we are improving or not, if we are delivering the expectations of the society, of the, let's say, territories that are unfortunately experiencing the outage. So this is our approach. So the message I want to pass is that, going to the synthesis, is it cannot be also about hardening. Hardening, it's of course the most important part, but if you don't play with the other R's, hardening, it's a waste of money at the end.
Thank you. So maybe if we go over to Mark and try and get even more international perspective into this. From your experience, is what we've been hearing so far more or less what is also reflected internationally, or are there regions you might be aware of where the story has even been progressing, where DSOs or utilities are even more active, or is Europe more or less at the forefront of the discussion, also in the adaptation and mitigation, both at the same time kind of framework that we're looking at here?
Okay, that's a very good question. And I think actually that the dealing with severe weather, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, wildfires associated with droughts and heat has been a problem in North America for a number of years. So many stakeholder groups and strategies for dealing with those events and planning for them have been developed in North America, which I think some of them could be very applicable to Europe. Australia is another location where very interesting strategies have been developed. For example, in North America, we have a very extensive mutual aid system where one utility gets aid from other utilities in the region when they're trying to respond to a storm, so that they don't have to hire crews to deal with the demand associated with a storm condition. They can share crews during those conditions. This is a big problem when a storm affects a whole region, but it does work very well. For instance, after Superstorm Sandy, one of the strategies that Con Edison put in place was to purchase 300 additional trouble trucks beyond what they need for their normal repairs and dealing with their system, but specifically to have crews that are coming in from other utilities have trucks that they can use to help restore the system after a major disaster. So that's purely a resilience investment. Similarly, utilities have been working with EI and regulators to develop stocks of spares of actual assets, like large transformers that are mobile, that can be brought in for replacement in a failure, or when large parts of a transmission are impacted by a storm or other conditions, so that each utility does not have to have the same number of spares. They can share on a regional basis the actual assets for responding to unusual conditions. And that's a good example of the 4 R's of being able to not only build in resiliency, but also respond faster and restore the system on a quicker basis. I think that approaches that are being taken now to proactively deal with resilience in the future are common around the world. We mentioned digitalization, automation, sensors, data analytics is a big part of a resilience strategy, and it has to be part of the planning of how that can maybe change your investment approach in the actual assets themselves, how you can get more life out of the assets and extend their life through understanding better when they're about to fail or their conditions at a given time. I think around the world, we're seeing the importance of multi-stakeholder approaches of involving communities as distributed resources become more common, energy storage becomes more common. The community investments can be part of the resilience strategy. We're seeing that play out in a big way in California in dealing with wildfires and safety conditions during wildfires. Customers and communities can put in place microgrids or even individual households be able to operate when the grid is down. And that provides more flexibility in how the grid gets operated if we have local resilience as part of the solution as well. So all these strategies have to be taken into account as we develop new planning approaches for dealing with climate change and the changing nature of conditions that we're going to have to deal with. But those are a few examples anyway.
Thank you. I believe what you've just been saying resonates well with Elena has been mentioning, namely that you need some extra infrastructure in place basically to be able to react and to be able to keep on the security of supply even if you're hit by a certain event. So I believe there is a common theme. Just very quickly, looking at the generation side, is there anything particular that you would like to mention on that?
Well, I think the generation side is very important. We often talk about the topic of resource adequacy and making with the increasing integration of renewables and the need for flexibility and capacity at all times. And at the same time, dealing with things like severe cold spells or severe heat that can impact the performance and operation of individual generators, that has to be considered as part of making sure that we're going to have enough resources, both central resources and distributed resources, including effects of intermittency from renewables, as part of our resource picture. And that's part of the resilience strategy, is making sure that we have the generation resources to meet demand in the future at all times from an operational point of view. So that's a very important, increasingly important part of the resilience picture right now. The Texas example of the cold spell where we couldn't use coal plants because coal piles were frozen, or the issue of sector coupling where gas lines are not operational, so we're not getting gas to generators that for other reasons associated with the cold spell. Those kinds of multi-sector planning have to be part of our resilience strategy from a generation point of view.
Thank you. And I believe that's the perfect moment to come to Alexandre now. Welcome to you as well. And you are, of course, working very hard on the mitigation front. And the question is what needs to be done on the power station side, on the generation side, in terms of adaptation. And of course, you have different technologies now that you're looking at, especially in EDF as well. And maybe you can share some thoughts on how you do actually adapt, while of course on the mitigation, I believe we've come quite a long way already.
Yes, of course, and thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very pleased to be part of this conversation today. And of course, when you talk about resilience, before even resilience of your operations and maintenance and investment, you have to understand the science and how future climate is going to impact your assets. At EDF, we have 15 climate researchers in our R&D unit, plus a dedicated team of hydro meteo experts for the water component, which is critical for hydro and nuclear activity. And so that helps us to understand and interpret actually what the climate science tells us, which starts also with actually understanding climate science itself. What are the radiative forcing scenarios and climate models, what downscaling of those climate models means and how it is done, how to select the climate projections that will eventually make sense for us. And obviously, this depends on the type of technology that you are contemplating, whether you are looking at existing assets or future projects. This also depends whether you are looking at safety, ensuring the safety of your assets, in which case you have to use the most penalizing scenarios and extreme conditions, or whether you're looking at projected generation outputs. And so what is at stake here is isolating the key trends and the main variables, if I may say, both from a chronic standpoint and an extreme event standpoint, and the variability of all that. And so then you have to try and make sense of that science and assess the specific impacts on your assets. So in a sense, what do I have to adapt to? A good way to do that is to work, we found at EDF that it is to work on alter egos in terms of locations. So for instance, in 2050, the climate in Paris may look like the climate in Istanbul today. Berlin will look like northern Italy, and London will look like Barcelona. So this is actually an interesting way we found to assess the impacts of future climate on your facilities, on your staff, the impacts that it will have on your direct supply chain, and the impact that it will have on services and infrastructure that you depend on as a generator. And it helped us realize that resilience is actually a systemic issue, that one cannot be resilient alone. We must consider the local environment and value chains surrounding the power plants, and our dependence on stakeholders to ensure collective resilience. And this is one of the aspects actually which I think is addressed in the report that you're releasing today. Now, to the heart of the question, I mean, investing in adaptation is not really a question of choice. It's, climate change is happening. Antonio said it. We have to ensure existing assets will keep on delivering to the expected level of safety and performance, and we need to make sure our projects are resilient to future climate conditions. So for operations and maintenance, the key issues are really adapting our long-dating assets, such as nuclear and hydro, and there's plenty of examples of that. For hydro, a key challenge is to maintain the capacity of flood evacuation infrastructure, the so-called spillways, which may require to modify the dams. And one of the ways we've found to accommodate for that challenge is on some dams to create spillways, which is going to increase the linear surface through which the flood can be evacuated, and to create those so-called piano keyware spillways, which are really well suited in some cases and enable us to cater for the expected increase in river flows without modifying the whole structure of the dam. For nuclear, I mean, cooling is key, of course, and for reactors located along rivers, it is important to adapt both the technical facilities, but also the whole water management around the nuclear power stations, and to optimize them between the different water uses, including optimization between hydro facilities and nuclear facilities, and we've been developing ways to do that for a number of years in France now. And beyond cooling, we have to make sure that all mechanical, electrical, IT equipment can operate as efficiently as possible in a context with longer and more extreme heat waves, for instance. So this means reinforcing HVAC and cooling units, reinforcing IT. So it goes far beyond what you could expect to be the main challenges of a nuclear power station. When we look at future projects, investments in future projects, of course, the time horizon you are looking at is a key driver, and is going to be different from one technology to the next. For instance, for new nuclear projects in France, the time horizon we are looking at is 2100. So we have to project what the weather is likely, what the climate is likely going to be, more than 70 years from now, nearly 80 years from now. And there's a number of variables you have to look at, which are critical. One of them is that by that time the sea level is likely to be significantly different from what we are experiencing today. So for nuclear power stations that are located by the seashore, you have to consider both the average sea level rise and also the potential for sea level surge during storms. And this is necessary to properly plan for the level of the platform on which your power station is going to be located, but also the kind of sea defense facilities like seawalls that you have to implement. And for renewables, the challenge might be a bit different. It's more. It has more to do with resilience to extreme events and to climate viability. Well, one known example is the icing episode that affected most of Texas wind capacity in February 2021. And the takeaway from that is that in regions like North America or Europe, windmills need to be able to withstand both extreme hot and extreme cold temperatures, because extreme cold is still a possibility in a changing climate. And so we have, and the technical solutions to cater for that are here with blade heating systems. But at the end of the day, maybe for renewables, the specificity is that the role of wind and solar in ensuring security of supply is maybe not as critical. It is not expected to be as critical as for hydro, nuclear, or thermal capacity, purely dispatchable capacity. So adaptation measures in renewables may be more focused on preserving the assets from severe damage.
Okay.
And the conclusion from that is that, of course, the expectation is probably higher on our nuclear and hydro assets, and we intend to live up to that expectation.
Thank you. Thank you very much also for this idea of using this persona kind of approach where you look at a different city that might actually be close to where the city that you're really having to take care of might actually be in 30 years' time. That's a very interesting approach of doing it. Now, let's come to Annegret and get her into the discussion as well. From the regulatory perspective, Annegret, has resilience been something that you have been discussing within the CER environment? Is that something that is on your agenda as the federal regulation agency in Germany? Also maybe in the interplay of the infrastructures, because as we all know, without any communications, you have problems in keeping the other infrastructures running. So what is your take on it, basically?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you also for having me here for this interesting debate. Let me try to bring my perspective in it. And I think that there were a lot of things said already. However, I think we need also to structure a little bit the discussion. One thing is the overall climate change, and of course also the long-term goal towards climate neutrality that we have across the world. I think even though Sharm el-Sheikh tried not to touch too much upon it, but I think this objective is still the objective. And in Europe we have the 2050 target. And in this regard, of course, we all know that the energy system and the economy as a whole will change. There will be a lot more decentralized energy resources used, and accordingly, the energy grids, the infrastructure have to be adapted to this, to use this term. And there's also, of course, infrastructure investment needed. But I think the other key element that we have there is the additional use of flexibility for demand-side response and storage in the future, also in the electricity system much more, which I think offsets to a certain extent the classical capex investment by making use more of flexibility resources. Of course, I'm well aware of the fact that this also requires investments in infrastructure to make the infrastructure ready to accommodate the additional flexibility, but still I think we cannot just add up the usual investment figures there. So I think that is one important aspect, and of course anything that has to do with incentives for investment, and I'm now limiting this first to infrastructure investment, are like incentive regulation, which for example we have here in Germany, and we think that a TOTEX approach catches better the effects and also in particular on the hardening or on the quality of the grid in the end, rather than more specific incentive schemes. But that may be a discussion for when we have more detail for more details. But overall, I want to say that there is a regulatory approach that can handle these. And I would also like to say where there is a need to invest for the purpose of resilience, and I would like to take this together, but also in a way separate. That means that maybe that on the one side, if there is a need to have more resilient grids which require a higher infrastructure capacity, then this should not be a separate regulatory scheme, but it should fit into the normal incentive regulation or the normal regulatory system that you apply. It should not be something separate in that sense, but it is something separate in the terms of what do you need it for? And I come back to this in a moment. The important point here is that this is something that should fit in the network planning and also in the incentive regulation. And as I said, if there is a need for this, then this should be factored in, and that should show in the usual parameters. Yeah, so if there is higher uncertainty, that would change the relevant cost of capital, and also all the other parameters or measures that were needed that were mentioned should be in the parameter. So I think there is nothing that requires a system change, but rather something that factors in these element of resilience into the regulatory scheme, like an incentive scheme that you figure in. So I think that is one aspect that I would like to bring in here. And the other aspect, as I mentioned already, this is an issue where we have, of course, a capex, but also with more flexibility and more processes there, an issue maybe of OPEX and a changed relation in the system. But that is still something that I would say we can handle with our regulatory tools, regulatory asset base, etc., factoring it in via the relevant parameters of the system that we use. The other aspect, and this I think is something where we take into account the targets and the need to reach climate neutrality. So a longer term perspective. The other element that was discussed here are things like extreme weather events. And of course, I know the two are related, and I come back to this in a moment, but I want to treat it separately because I think being prepared in the sense like both Mark and also Antonio mentioned it, being the preparedness and increasing responsiveness, etc., is something that requires, in particular, organizational, as you called it, Franz, organizational preparedness, making the processes work well. And I think here we also have already had some progress, have made some progress, for example, in Europe, when in, I think it was in 2005 or 2006, the ship cut off an important transmission line. Somewhere in Germany, the lights went out quite a long time in Portugal until the system was restored, if I may say so. And now we have network codes, which I think, and for example, for restorers and system operation, etc., which prescribe a faster reaction and a more standardized, you used the word standards, I think that is very important, step-by-step way on how transmission operators communicate and interact with each other to restore the system in a fast way and in a prescribed way. For example, when last, I think it was somewhere in January, there was the incident in the southeast of Europe, then there was, I think it was 35 or 45 minutes, and after that the separation of the two areas were already restored. Yeah, and I think this is something which shows how important it is to have the processes codified, for example, in the system operation guidelines, in the network codes, and having a system, a close interaction of the system operators and also, of course, of other players that are important in here. So that is something that needs to be prepared, and that is, in my view, less an issue of additional investment, but more an issue of having the processes in place. And I mentioned already the additional investment that is needed that should be factored in the usual capital, in the usual incentive schemes and the usual regulatory schemes, as I mentioned. But here, this extra effect, so to speak, is something that would be handled, in my view, on the short term, in a short-term basis, by having the processes in place and then living up to the processes there. I think that is the key. So we have the long-term issue, and I think we should not confuse this with these short-term issues, which I put on more in a bit of the let's say procedural side of things, if I may use the term here. And this is something, for me, this is quite important to make this separation or this differentiation. Because I think that if we reach climate neutrality, the let's say unforeseeable and extreme weather, or difficult to foresee weather, extreme weather incidents should be reduced. And I think this is the important part here. And that's why I'm saying we should not, let's say, blindly invest now in something that maybe in the near future, and we don't have much time for this, is not needed. Yeah, that's why I would like to separate the two issues, let's say conceptually, and knowing that there is a link between the two, but also knowing that if we achieve the transition to climate neutrality, we should also have an achievement on the short-term issues of extreme weather. And that's why it's better to handle those, first of all, in the process way that I described, and have the important investments made with a view to reaching climate neutrality. And so this is the three elements that I would like to contribute to discussion. And I think one aspect is also should be mentioned absolutely, that what you also mentioned, one thing is of course important, the digitalization. Yeah, this is reducing the costs, making the whole system more efficient, including the what I described as short-term measures, procedural measures to handle this. This is also an issue of a quick communication enabled by functioning digitalization and digital grids, which also enable smart grids, let's say, which also enables then a quicker shutdown where needed, and a faster ramp up where needed on the other side. Yeah, so that is of course an important element to cope with these with the process, and to align the two processes that I mentioned, the longer term and the short term, but not to confuse them or to mix them. So I think and of course, when you say digitalization, at the same time, you need to think of cybersecurity. Absolutely right. And we have mentioned the term here as well. Here, I think it is also very positive that we are currently developing the cybersecurity network code that will ensure a safer cyber system and safer communication. Yeah, so that is, if we want to use the advantages of more digitalization, we at the same time must be aware that this increases certain risks, cyber risks, and therefore the only way to mitigate these risks is to have better cybersecurity standards or cybersecurity network codes, as we call it, and interacting, of course, also with the agency, for example, the ENISA, to ensure that this is implemented in a proper way, and where energy regulators have the competence, they of course also will implement this and monitor this accordingly. I think that's my 10 minutes, so to speak, and happy to discuss further.
So thank you, Annegret, for this regulatory perspective. You also made very clear that you have different perspectives, and it was also very hopeful, I believe, in saying that maybe we will not see that much extreme weather events in the future if we actually get to climate neutrality. I believe that's what we all hope. Time is actually running fast, and thank you so far for all the messages that you gave. We would like to go into one final quick round, and I'll just take you in the order that I see you on my screen right now. So maybe in 20 seconds, Mark, if from what you've heard and what your own messages were today, if you would have to give them once again, what would you tell the audience?
Yeah, the discussion has been fantastic, and I'll just reiterate three themes that I thought were absolutely critical here. One is that resiliency is different than our normal investment decision making, that where we can, as a utility, we can make the decisions kind of on our own. It involves all of society, communities, customers, and all kinds of stakeholders. So multi-stakeholder approach to the entire process is critical. We need to find new approaches to valuing resiliency, taking into account all those stakeholders and the indirect costs, and finally working together to have a common framework between regulators, stakeholders, and utilities, generation providers to evaluate the costs and benefits of those investment decisions is a challenge that we have in front of us now.
Thank you. Elena, from your point of view, still having the feeling that everything is being set out, or did you hear something where you would say maybe we have to go back and do some more discussions, some more thinking?
I think I would like to reiterate from the perspective of the European regulator the importance of planning that should not be underestimated, and the sort of time lag that exists between reaching climate neutrality and the efficiency of measures for climate adaptation. So just to say, these are not perfect, communicating vases. Unfortunately, however, we would wish to have it, because the biophysical system of Earth is unfortunately have been tested for too long time. I have heard very good points about the integrated approach that both EDF and NL have to extreme weather or incident handling through the whole chain: prevention, preparedness, response, recovery, and you come back with the learnings. I very much appreciated the point coming out that it's not about investment, but it's about really smart optimization and seeing where you still need the investment. So probably there is a huge hype being put on investment, and there should be much more emphasis put indeed on a sort of reallocation of resources and organizational resilience enhancing measures. And thank you very much, because this has been quite a deep dive into the operation of your sectors, and extremely valuable insights given.
Thank you also for the feedback. Alexandre, I believe that this organizational issue that Elena was just touching upon is also something you mentioned in checking the water levels and making your mind up on where to put the water, either in the hydro or in the nuclear power plants. So what are your final thoughts for today?
Well, thank you for this great discussion. Well, I think I'm going to reiterate what everyone has been saying. This is very much systemic. You cannot be resilient alone. You have to work with your supply chain. You have to work with your local partners and stakeholders to make sure that we are all resilient together. I would also reiterate the point that it's critical to be to understand the science in order to make the right decisions, to make the right kind of impact assessment on your existing assets and your future investments. And so, in order to be able to go for the right measures and the right design. And maybe last thing, adaptation is not something of tomorrow. It's something of today. It starts now, and we're very much onto it at EDF.
Merci, Antonio. You once raised your thumb while Annegret was talking. I believe it was on TOTEX. So maybe if you want to come back to that very quickly, you're very welcome. Otherwise, please, whatever has been the result for you, please share.
I raised my thumb up for the TOTEX approach, because I think most of the countries are considering in several public service regulatory regime to transition, taking also the experience from UK and other few countries that already moved in that direction, in order to have a more, let's say, comprehensive quest for efficiency in the allocation of resources, not only from the capex point of view, but also from the opex point of view. So at the end, the benefits for the consumer is in the right allocation of the tariff, which is composed by the two components, slow money and the fast money. So I was, let's say, in agreement with that view, but I have also to underline one thing on which I quite strongly disagree. It's that I think it would be a tragic mistakes to confuse the time span between the climate adaptation and results of what we believe and hope with all our souls and hearts could be the climate neutrality, which will happen maybe in 2050, I hope earlier, but at 1.5 degrees temperature higher than today. We are at 1.3 compared to the baseline, so we are experiencing today the effect of the climate change. We would stay with those effects for decades, until when the effects of the carbon reduction, not the carbon neutrality, is going to take place, if, when, and how. So that means that, let's say, balancing the investments, the procedures, the rules, the goals on the climate adaptation with the hope of having less phenomena in the future, for me, would be a tragic mistake. We have to react now. We have to adapt the infrastructures, the crucial paramount important infrastructure, talking about gas pipelines, electricity distribution lines, and so far and so on, to the possibility that we will stay for decades with harsher environments. Then if we cope, we succeed as a generation to bring this back to normality, fantastic. We have wasted a little bit of dollars or euros around, but if we don't have the life we have today. So I would not risk on that. Thank you. Now, the final word, as always, in a discussion like that, belongs to the regulator. And Annegret, if you please be quick, because we really are running out of time, but we would like to hear your thoughts at the final point of this discussion.
A very quick word also to avoid misunderstandings. I was not saying that we should wait until 2050 to invest. No, don't get me wrong. My point was more to prioritize these type of investments over the need for resilient investment and other processes. Let me give you one example, and then why I'm saying this, and then we can finish. Take the example that you just gave with the gas pipelines. If, let's say, in the extreme case that we look at these gas pipelines now, we would repair Nord Stream 1. Yeah, I'm saying this just as an extreme example. This would not be correct. The real thing would be to get H2 infrastructure or H2 ready infrastructure. Even if you use existing pipelines, you would not just restore them or make them fit for purpose for the restoration or resilience. You would try to invest in a way that this can be used for the climate neutral hydrogen infrastructure. So just as to bring out the point more, and of course don't quote me on Nord Stream. This is just an extreme example.
So thank you very much. Now, this is where our discussion, unfortunately, has to come to an end. I would like to thank you all once again. Elena Wisner-Malitkowska from the Head of Unit Adaptation and Resilience of Climate Change in DG Klima for joining us here today. Also, Antonio Camisecra from Enel Grids for giving the Enel perspective. Mark McGranahan from EPRI for our study partner, bringing in the international perspective. Alexandre Marty from EDF for joining us and giving some generation perspective, also looking at different types of generators, all carbon neutral ones, of course. And finally, Annegret Gröbel, President of CER, for her presentation and thoughts on how to cope with all that from a regulatory point of view. I hope that that was also helpful for everybody who was tuning in. I'm very much looking forward to keep this discussion going and to actually advance it, because I believe, as we all have been saying today, we only can fix this problem together. So thank you for being here, and thank you everybody for joining. Now, it has been my pleasure to moderate this dialogue today on resilience in the energy system, the coming storm, in order to present the study done by Eurelectric. And I believe the time spent on the discussion was worthwhile. And we learned, I believe, quite a few things that I would like to summarize right now. First of all, both Elena for DG Klima as well as Annegret for CER were in agreement that, especially on the European level, the regulatory framework was already in place also to cover resilience. And the challenge with that is, as Antonio and Alexander have showed us, the implementation, of course, within the companies, the real measures that you take. And as we've also clearly learned, is all companies in the sector, TSOs, DSOs, as well as the generation side, and maybe even the retailers, in the end, have to work together in order to make the energy system as resilient as possible. And that's also what the international experience, as EPRI has shown us, clearly shows and proves. And that is why I believe that was the one point where everybody could agree cooperation is key. And that will mean three things, as we've also learned. It will mean additional investments to harden the grid in order to make it as sustainable and resilient as possible for what is coming in terms of extreme weather. B, it will mean additional staff. You can't work a larger system without some additional hands to work it. And C, it will mean better and more hardened organizational procedures in order to be able to harvest the benefits of what you have been investing and what you have as staff ready. There are some, let's say, mitigating measures within that. So there is, of course, flexibility that might be helpful in an event of extreme weather. There is storage that will also help stabilizing the electricity grids in the future, hopefully. And there is, and also everybody could agree on that, there is digitization and digitalization that will help us to understand the world around us better, to see little things that will tell us something about the system being not very stable and so on. Regulatory-wise, everybody seemed to agree that TOTEX was the right approach, but as I have been a regulatory manager for almost my professional life, I can tell you that the devil in regulation is mostly in the details. And despite all the mitigation that we have already been doing in bringing more green power to the system, the way to net zero is still very long. And that way will be a very hard way. And therefore, at Eurelectric, we believe that the time to do the resilience investment is now. We should not be waiting, because waiting will only be more expensive in the end than reacting, hardening, and preparing while we can. Thank you for joining us for this presentation of the study today, and we are looking forward to discussing these issues further.